All right, then I think we can begin. Professor Renato, if you would like to say a few words to introduce Professor Gorman again, and then we'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stump. Thank you, Professor Gorman. It's it's an honor to be here with you, with you both, and with Daniel and Menash, who are being excellent. They are doing terrific job. Thank you very much for everything. Bom, pessoal, hoje nossa terceira aula, né, no nosso curso de filosofia, de metafísica, né, dado pelo professor Gorman, essa oportunidade extraordinária que nós estamos tendo, né, de ter um professor dessa categoria podendo dialogar conosco, nos ensinar, né? E um tema que é tão relevante, né? A metafísica de fato hoje está num momento assim muito efervescente, eu diria, né? E grande parte disso vem justamente dos norte-americanos. E o professor Gorman é um nome de excelência dentro desse campo. Né? Então, hoje, o Daniel, o assistente da professora Stamp, já colocou, né, o resumo dos temas que vão ser tratados hoje, estão aí no chat. Então, queria lembrar vocês, né, uma vez mais, de deixar a câmera aberta, né, porque o professor Gorman ele pediu, a professora Stamp também pediram isso, né, fazer as perguntas depois nós fazemos no final. Passaram aí no chat o link das aulas que já foram gravadas, já estão no canal do YouTube do ISC, né, o Ignition, né, Corps, né, que é um Student Corps que também está fazendo também uma série de temas, de vídeos extraordinários que vale a pena a gente conhecer. Então, o professor Gorman é professor da Catholic University of America em Washington, né, é uma pessoa com um currículo extraordinário, que teve estadias, né, também na Europa, na Alemanha, concretamente, né? Então, como eu dizia para vocês, é uma oportunidade até para vocês poderem comparar as diferenças que há entre o que o professor Gorman fala e o que eu falo, né? Nós somos metafísicos ambos, né? Temos uma visão realista, uma base tomista, mas vocês vão percebendo as diferenças e eu acho que isso daí enriquece muito também. Para mim, está sendo uma oportunidade ótima, né? Tenho certeza que para todo mundo também. Então, agradeço uma vez, né, o tema hoje da modalidade. Professor Gorman, thank you once again for kindness, no, for dedication. Professor Stump for this opportunity, her generosity with us is amazing, no, and everybody else who is in this series, no, Menash and Daniel, thank you very much, and thank you for the students for being here with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that kind introduction. And Michael, we will now turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. This is the third lecture. We're going to talk about what's often called modal concepts or modal metaphysics. I'll explain that word in a moment. But the four main parts of the talk are this. I'm going to just talk about some of the basic ideas, the basic modal concepts, and try to explain them in what I hope is an intuitive way. Um, it's actually pretty difficult to make them perfectly clear, and you can make them very, very, very technical, and that makes them clear in a way. But I'm not sure it actually makes them clear in the deepest and most important way. So, being technical and being non-technical and swerving back and forth between them is somehow the secret to this. Anyway, I'll explain them in what I hope is a kind of intuitive way, and then I will in the second section talk about a way that has become very common in contemporary philosophy, a way of making sense of these concepts, which is by talking in terms of possible worlds. Um, and I'll just explain that in a sort of rough and ready way. And then in the third section, I will talk about two of the main ways in which people have tried to explain the metaphysics behind possible worlds. And then in the fourth section, I will discuss how you might want to talk about modality in a way that does not involve possible worlds. I think Aristotle and Aquinas would not use, I mean, they might use the language of possible worlds if they were here today, but I don't think that they would use the concepts in a very deep way. So I want to talk about how you could talk about modality without possible worlds. And it's going to lead to a problem or a puzzle or a question which I won't resolve today. Okay, so section 1, basic modal concepts. So the concepts I want to talk about are things like this: necessity, possibility, contingency, and so on. So I'll talk about, I have a bunch of different concepts on the board here. Now, I have some underlined words. These are the concepts that I want you to think about for now. And then over here is just a brief little bits of text that have to do with possible worlds, but we're not going to be talking about that yet. So for now, just focus on the words that are underlined, and I'll try to talk about them in a way that I hope makes sense. So some things you might say are true. For example, Michael Gorman is sitting. I mean, you can't actually see that, but there's my chair. See, I'm sitting. Okay, so that's something that's true. Here's something else that's true. 2 plus 2 is 4, right? That's a well-known mathematical truth. Okay, so that's the first one on the list. Now, some things are not merely true. They're not just true, not simply true. They are necessarily true. So a great example here is 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It must be true. It has to be true. There's no way for it not to be true. It doesn't matter how the world works out. It doesn't matter. That's the way it has to be. But that's not true for Gorman is sitting, right? I could stand up. I could fall over. There's a lot of other ways that I could be. So although it's true that I'm sitting, it's not necessarily true. But it's necessarily true that 2 plus 2 are 4. Well, if some things that are true are not necessarily true, we could say that they are contingently true, which is down almost at the bottom here. So it's contingently true that I am sitting. It's true, but it's not necessarily true. It's contingently true that you are listening to this lecture right now. You could be out doing something else instead. Okay, now the next thing I want to mention is third on this list. Some things are impossible. Now, impossible and necessarily false turn out to be the same. So it's impossible for 2 plus 2 to be 5. It doesn't matter. It's not like if God had made the world differently, he could have made 2 plus 2 equal 5. It just can't be that way. Or it's impossible for a squirrel to be a prime number. It can't happen. So some things are impossible. Now, the next thing I want to mention is that some things are merely possible. Now, what I mean by merely possible is that they're possible, but they are not actual. They're not actually true. For example, here's something you could say: Gorman is standing. Now, right now, I'm not standing, but I could be standing. So it's possible, but it's merely possible. It's only possible, but it's not actual. Now, that can be contrasted. So merely possible is at the bottom, and then the fourth one there is possible. Now, in a way, the concept of possibility, in the sense that's relevant for us here, is the most difficult in a way, because it deviates somewhat from the way we normally use the language of possibility in everyday speech. Or, well, at least that's true in English. I'm going to guess that it's true in Portuguese as well. I could be wrong. I would be fascinated if I were wrong about that, but I bet not. So something is possible if it could be, even if, in fact, it also actually is. So before I said it was merely possible that I am standing. That's to say it's possible for me to be standing. I could be standing, but I'm not. But in the sense that I'm interested in now, not merely possible, but rather possible without the merely, just possible. In that sense, it's possible for me to be standing, but it's also possible for me to be sitting. It's possible for me to be sitting and I'm actually sitting. So in this sense of possible, it's a broader sense. It's consistent with something being actually true. And in fact, it's consistent with something being necessarily true. So in this sense, you could say it's possible for me to be standing. It's possible for me to be sitting, and it's possible for 2 plus 2 to equal 4. It's actually true that 2 plus 2 is 4, and it's even necessarily true, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible. So that last one, it's as I say, it's a little bit, it deviates a little bit. If you know anything about that famous paper by Grice on conversational implicature, that's the sort of thing I have in mind. Normally, if something is true, and especially if it's necessarily true, you wouldn't say that it's possible because it would mislead everyone. If I said, well, possibly I wear eyeglasses, you would be puzzled. Like, what do you mean? Why are you saying that? You are wearing eyeglasses. It would be confusing. Why should I say such a thing? So this is a technical use of the word possible that doesn't correlate completely with the way we use it in everyday speech. But you just have to get used to it. Okay. Now then, so those are a bunch of different things. Now, all of them can be looked at as modalities of truth. Some things are true. Some things are not merely true. They are necessarily true, or contingently true, or possibly true. So these are all modes in which things can be true. And because of that, this kind of language is sometimes called modal language. And we can talk about modal truths. We can talk about modal logic. And if there's metaphysics behind this, and of course there is, then we could talk about modal metaphysics. Now, is this the only way in which the word mode or modal has been used in philosophy? No. It gets used in other ways as well, and I'm sorry. As you know, that's just the way it happens in philosophy. But for today, hopefully we won't have any exceptions. Today, modal just means having to do with this. All right. Now, let me spell out a bit more explicitly something that I've already hinted at. Modal concerns come up in language. So we can say that the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4, that sentence is necessarily true. And I just made a remark about language, about that sentence. But modal issues also concern thought. So I could say my thought that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessarily true. So now we're applying modality to the realm of thought. Or we could apply modality to the realm of reality. We could say that the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 holds true necessarily. So if we say that, then we're talking not just about our language or about our thoughts, but about reality itself. Now, obviously, whether you can do that or not is controversial. Everything's controversial, but I'm just making these distinctions, and it's useful to keep them in mind. Okay, so that's all I have to say now for the first section of the talk, just laying out the basic concepts. The next thing I want to do is talk about possible worlds. Now, some people really like possible worlds and like talking about possible worlds. And some people find them very frustrating and they get very angry. And there's, something legitimate about all of these perspectives, perhaps. What I want to do is start in a slow and easy way. Let's just think of possible worlds as a form of speech, as a kind of language that people use when they're talking about modality. And I'm going to just present it that way. And I'm going to ask you right now not to think too hard about what it actually means. I'm just going to explain a little bit about how we use the terminology and ask you to just pause and worry about the metaphysics later. I will get to that. Don't worry. Um, but I think it's useful to just kind of learn how to go with the flow a little bit. So the first most intuitive um, idea is that a world or a possible world, it's a way that things could be. It's a way that everything could be. It's like a scenario for all of reality. So just think of it very roughly in that way. So if I say, oh, well, in a different possible world, I would have blue hair. What I mean is, if things were different, I would have blue hair. If things had worked out differently, or something like that. That's all it means, at least for now. So let me now go through these concepts on the board, and I'm going to go through them in the order of the board, and show and just explain briefly how people apply possible worlds talk, possible worlds language to these concepts. So the first one is necessary when someone says that something, no, the first one is true. Oh, I'm not going through them in order. So, okay, we're going to start with the second one. When somebody says that something is necessarily true, they sometimes mean it's true in all possible worlds. So try to just like let that come in to your mind, right? In every way the world could be, in all possible worlds, in all possible scenarios, no matter how things turn out, no matter what, this thing would be true. So it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4 no matter what. There's no scenario, there's no world, there's no universe in which 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. That's the idea. Okay? And then something that's impossible is something that's true in no possible world. There's no possible world in which 2 plus 2 is 5. It can't be that way. There's no scenario in which that turns out to be. Now then, to say that something is possible, now this is in the technical sense in which we discussed it. That's to say, a sense that consistent with something being true and even with something being necessarily true. Something is said to be possible if it's true in at least one possible world. So if you think of all the possible worlds, all the possible scenarios, all the ways everything could be, in at least one of them, this one is true. So if you say it's possible for Gorman to have blue hair, there is a possible world, a possible scenario. It could happen, at least one of them, I actually do have blue hair. Okay, now at the top there, we have what's true. So things that are true, actually true, are things that are true in this possible world. The possible world, there's one of the possible worlds has become actual. It has been put into play, implemented, you might say. And the things that are true are the ones that are true in this world. So it is true, that I have brown hair. It is true that I'm sitting, and those things are true in this world. Now, something is contingently true. Remember, that means that it's true, but it's not necessarily true. So something that's contingently true is true in this world, but it's not true in all worlds. So it's contingently true that I am sitting. That means there are some other worlds in which I'm not sitting. And then finally, something is merely possible but not actual, means it's true in some possible world, maybe many possible worlds, but not in this one, not true in this one. So it's merely possible that I have blue hair, but it's not actually the case. So again, remember, if something is possible, it might also be true and it might even be necessarily true. And coming at it the other way, if something is necessarily true, then it's also true, and it's also possible. So if something is necessarily true, it's true in all the worlds. So if it's true in all the worlds, then it's got to be true in this world. So it's true. And if it's true in this world, then it's true in at least one world. So it's possible. But it doesn't work the other way around. Just because something's possible, that doesn't mean it's actual. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Okay. So there I've tried to just quickly use the possible worlds language over and over again without really saying anything about what it means. Although I've also used a few very roughly equivalent expressions. I talked about scenarios. I talked about ways things could be. And I'm hoping that for at least some of you, this will have some intuitive value, even if you're also very skeptical metaphysically, which is good. So, but what I want to do now is go through this again, but add a little bit more content to the expression possible world, because there is a very helpful way of explaining it that, well, I think it's helpful. So, I mean, I'm just going to start talking about it. So, what I want to do now is introduce the idea of a state of affairs. If you're a Husserl person, this will be familiar to you. Um, so, a state of affairs is a way for something to be. So, for example, Gorman is sitting, or my sitting down, Gorman's sitting. That's a state of affairs. I'm a thing and I'm doing something, or I have some property, something like that. So Gorman's sitting. It's the case that Gorman is sitting. It's the case that you are listening to a lecture. These are states of affairs. Now, the state of affairs Gorman is sitting, it's a very small state of affairs. It only includes me and one little thing that I'm doing. But there are some bigger states of affairs. So, for example, Gorman is sitting and it's raining in Washington, D.C. So now you've got a state of affairs with two elements, not just one. Now, this second state of affairs is, so to speak, larger, bigger than the first one, but it's not that big. It leaves out a lot of things. It doesn't say anything about whether I'm wearing black shoes or brown shoes. It doesn't say anything about whether you are currently driving a car. So this bigger state of affairs, it's bigger, it's larger, but it's not maximally big. It's not a maximal state of affairs. A maximal state of affairs is a state of affairs that leaves nothing out. Nothing is excluded. All questions are answered. All issues are settled. So Gorman is sitting or not. You are driving an automobile or not. You have brown shoes on or not. All the way. So all the issues are settled. If you think of that big giant thing, that is a maximal state of affairs. Now then, wouldn't it be nice to have a little word for a maximal state of affairs? Here's the word. It's a world or a possible world. So if it's the way things are, then it's a complete description of the world that we're in right now. But you can also think of these as possible ways for things to be, right? So here's something that is possible. Right now, I'm standing, and you are driving an automobile while listening to this lecture, and it's snowing in Washington, D.C. That would be very surprising if it were snowing in Washington, D.C. in April, but it's not impossible. Okay, so that's a state of affairs. And if you fill out everything, which color shoes you were wearing, which direction my little squirrel is facing, every possible question, then you would have a maximal possible state of affairs. You would have a possible world. So it's a way that everything could be. So if you then think of that as a way of thinking about what is meant by a possible world, it might help a little bit to flesh this out. So if something is necessarily true, that means no matter how the world gets fleshed out, in every possible gigantic scenario, in every maximal state of affairs, the question 2 plus 2, is it 4? Yes or no? It's always going to be answered yes. The question, is my squirrel a prime number, is always going to be answered no. The question, are you driving a car, is sometimes going to be answered yes and sometimes going to be answered no. Now, what is the purpose of bringing in possible worlds language? Why would anybody ever do this? That's a very good question. Now, one answer has to do with some technicalities of modal logic. You can use possible worlds in certain logical systems, and they perform a very nice clarifying and unifying role. I'm not going to talk about that today at all. But it's worth knowing that on one level, that's what they are. They are a tool in some logical systems. A different use of the language is that for some people, it might just be an expression, almost perhaps a metaphorical expression, for helping them get a better understanding of concepts like necessary, impossible. So if I was trying to convince you that something was impossible, and you're like, what do you mean impossible? I don't know. And I said, well, look, like there's just no possible world in which that could happen. Some people might say, oh, I get it. Now I see what you mean. Or I say, you know, you could be driving a car while listening to a lecture. And you're like, I couldn't do that. You say, yeah, come on. All I'm saying is there's some possible world in which you're doing that. And you're like, oh, I see what you mean. Okay. For some people, that might work. So then in that situation, the language, I just mean the language really, of possible worlds would have a useful heuristic explanatory function. It would help them understand things better. Now, for both of those things that I just mentioned, the technical tool in modal logic and the heuristic metaphorical usage of possible worlds, for both of those, it could work. It could be a helpful way of using the language of possible worlds, even if there was nothing behind it metaphysically. Even if somebody said to me then, but wait, do you actually believe in possible worlds? I might say, oh, no, no, I don't believe in them. I'm just saying that when I talk like that, and then you understand better, right? That could happen, okay? So I think a lot of times in philosophy, um, they're playing one of these roles. And if you have metaphysical scruples, you should just not worry about it. So, I mean, I myself do not really believe in possible worlds, but I sometimes talk that way. And if someone said to me, hey, do you really mean that literally? I would say, well, no, I don't. And then I would have to explain it. But I do talk like that. So um, I just want to make clear that although there are important metaphysical issues, not all instances of people talking about possible worlds actually engage those metaphysical issues. Well, having raised this question about the metaphysics of possible worlds, I'm now going to talk about the metaphysics of possible worlds. So that's part 3 of the lecture. There are a number of competing theories about possible worlds. I mean, competing theories about what they are. I am going to mention 2 of them, 2 of the theories. I think it's fair to say that they are the most prominent theories. They're both very interesting and fun to think about. So the first has been developed especially by Alvin Plantinga. Now, for Plantinga, worlds are, they're sort of like Platonic objects. They're not universals. That wouldn't be right. In fact, they are maximal states of affairs. However, they are like Platonic universals in the sense that they have an existence that's a sort of eternal, independent existence on their own. So just as if you're a Platonic realist about universals, an extreme realist, as I sometimes called it, a Platonic realist, you think that those universals exist regardless of whether they have any instances. So the universal for squirrel exists even if this squirrel and all the other squirrels don't exist. Well, in a similar way, in an analogous way, all the possible worlds exist, even though many of them are never, so to speak, put into practice. So the possible world in which I have blue hair, it's not actualized, you can see that, but that possible world, it's still there. It's still there. Um, so here's a sort of an analogy that I think you could use. Think of a bunch of plays, of dramas, the plays of Shakespeare or Moliere or whatever. So think of a lot of plays and think of them all as books on a shelf. Now, only one of them has been pulled off the shelf and produced and realized, and now we have a play that's going on. But all the others are still there on the shelf. They're there. They just aren't being actualized. So I think the possible worlds are analogous to this. Now, um, so Plantinga has a lot of things to say about um, possible worlds. His theory is very complex and sophisticated. I want to just focus on one issue here. Um, for Plantinga, you and I, and everything really, exist in many different possible worlds all at the same time. Now, this has to be understood in the right way. Only one of the worlds has been put into practice or actualized. The way Plantinga's word for this is obtains, which is a kind of old-fashioned way of using that word, perhaps. Um, so I'm saying actualized, which is not really consistent with his terminology. I'm feeling a little bit guilty about that right now, but I think for our purposes, it's probably okay. Um, only one of the worlds is actually happening. Okay, so it's not like there's a whole bunch of me's doing a lot of different things in any normal sense. Nonetheless, in the other possible worlds, the possible worlds in which I have blue hair, the possible worlds in which I'm lecturing standing up, all of those possible worlds, it's me in those possible worlds. The possible worlds in which you are driving a car while listening to this lecture, it's you driving the car. Now, you might be wondering, what's the point of emphasizing this? So just hang on, give me 3 minutes, and you will see. I want to talk now, oops, yeah, about the other main way of thinking about possible worlds that I want to focus on. And that's the one that has been made famous by David Lewis. Now, for David Lewis, possible worlds are not Platonic objects. I think Lewis kind of prides himself on not believing in strange things like Platonic objects. So he says, if you want to know what a world is like, it's just a normal physical thing. Just look around. That's a world. You live in one. There's nothing Platonic about it. So far, it sounds like his theory is very commonsensical. But then he makes this very non-commonsensical, very surprising move. He says, there are other worlds, many, many other worlds. There's a world in which someone just like me is talking just like this, except he has blue hair. There's a world in which there's someone just like you who's driving a car while listening to this lecture. All of those worlds are physical. They're not, abstract Platonic entities, but they're all there. Now, you might think, wouldn't it be interesting to go visit one of those worlds? Well, you can't. There, you can't get there. They are all isolated from one another, spatially, temporally, causally. Well, if they're all physical, if they're all, in a sense, like this one, you might say, what makes this one so special? And Lewis would say, actually, there's really nothing special about this one. It's just that we live in it. So we call this one the actual world. But the people who live in the other world, they call their worlds the actual worlds. It's a little bit like I call my house home and you call your house home. So now I've already sort of let this slip. So now what I want to make it explicit. For Lewis, you and I only exist in this world. We don't exist in the other worlds. Other people do. Those people he calls our counterparts. Very roughly, your counterparts are the people in the other world who are most similar to you. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but um, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. Um, so this is an important difference between Plantinga and Lewis. So for Plantinga, well, let's put it this way. Both Plantinga and Lewis would say that, I mean, I think nobody listening to this lecture is driving a car. I don't know. I'm not looking at all the pictures. But anyway, probably nobody is. So I'm just going to say that, right? So you are not driving a car right now. But Plantinga and Lewis would agree that it's possible for you to be driving a car right now. And then, speaking loosely, they might both say that there is a world in which you are driving a car, a different world in which you're driving a car right now. However, that's only speaking loosely. For Plantinga, it's also true speaking strictly. If some other world were implemented, it would really be you driving the car. But for Lewis, it's not you driving the car in the other world. It's someone else. It's the person in the other world who is most similar to you. So this is an important difference between the two of them. Okay. We could talk about possible worlds for a long time. They're really fun and interesting. But what I want to do now is just to focus on the following issue. Believing in possible worlds might seem very strange. It's a lot to ask. If you have, if you believe in possible worlds in Plantinga sense as kind of abstract objects, you're asked to believe in a lot of things that you don't have any ordinary kind of evidence for. It's a very large ontology. It's a crowded ontology, if you will. If you think about possible worlds in Lewis's way, well, in one way, they're not that strange. They're just like this one. But in another way, it's very strange to imagine that all those worlds are out there. That might be even weirder. It might be even stranger. So one question that you might ask is, do we even need to believe in possible worlds at all? Maybe we don't need to believe in possible worlds. So that leads me to the fourth and last section of my talk, modality without possible worlds. So philosophers like Aristotle and Aquinas do not discuss possible worlds when they discuss issues like this. And it's not because they don't discuss issues like this. Aquinas and Aristotle are both well aware of modal issues. And Aristotle makes little, they're even a little bit aware of some of the issues in modal logic and stuff. They have just a completely different way of thinking about what's possible, what's necessary, and so forth. So I'm going to focus on this by talking about how they understand possibility. They don't think of possibility as meaning what's true in a possible world. For them, something's possible if there is an agent, a causal agent that can make it happen or bring it into existence. So let's say that it's possible for the window to be broken. Now, Aristotle would not say that that's because there's a possible world in which the window is broken. He would say that that's because there exists something, some kind of causal agent that has the power to break the window. For example, a baseball could break a window, or a hammer could break a window, or maybe you with your fist if you're very strong. That's not a good idea, though. Don't do that. So, the if you think about it this way, it's possible because there is a causal agent. Now, you might say, ah, but I've looked. There are no baseballs. So does that mean it's not possible for the window to break, right? Maybe some sad thing happened and all the baseballs were destroyed. Well, no, but there's still the raw materials for making a baseball. And so we could produce a baseball and then we could break the window. So um, it would, in that sense, it would still be true that things were possible because of the causal powers of agents. It's just that a little bit more needs to happen first. But possibility would still be based on um, the powers of agents. So that's the basic way in which people like Aristotle and Aquinas approach the question of what's possible and what's not possible. Now, there's an advantage. There's something good and nice and wonderful about thinking about this. You don't have to speculate about possible worlds. You just start with all of the entities that you have around you and say, these are enough to explain what's possible. So it's a nice, economical, efficient approach. However, there is a disadvantage to thinking about this. And this is going to lead to the question that I said I'll have to think about. Well, we're going to have to raise. So the disadvantage is something like this. It often seems that something is possible, even though we can't think of any way in which it could happen in terms of the causal agents that we have. So let me give an example. I'm not sure if it's a very good example. If it's not a good example, we'll just find a different example. The living organisms that we know of seem to be based on carbon, but it seems possible, in some sense, that there could be living organisms that are based on silicon. Now, you might, for this example to work to you, I would want you, you need to have two thoughts. You would think, yes, yes, that's possible, but also to think, I can't really think of any causal process that would ever result in that happening. So it seems like something that's possible, even though it's not something that can be brought about causally. Now, you might be thinking, oh, come on, I can easily think of such a process. Well, okay, then I'll try to find a different example. Maybe for electrons to have a different mass or something like that. That's a much more weird example. Um, but the main point here is to try to bring out the intuition that a lot of people have, which is that whether something is possible or not seems somehow independent of whether there's a causal agent that can bring it about. So for a lot of people, they would want to say this: I don't know whether there are causal processes that could result in a silicon-based living organism. However, I still think it's possible. Even if there were no such process, I think it would be possible for there to be such living organisms. Or some people might say, I think it's possible for electrons to have a different mass, even though there's no causal process that could bring that about. Here is a way of putting this. The concepts that I've been mentioning, electrons having a different mass, or silicon-based life, they seem to be not contradictory. There's no internal contradiction with these. And that seems to be enough to make them possible. Now, maybe you're not sure about that, which that's fine. But I'm just presenting this as a concern that can be generated. So That means that we seem to have two concepts of possibility, two ways of thinking about possibility. The first one is whatever is not self-contradictory. As long as there's no internal contradiction, it's possible. So a squirrel made out of rocks, I don't know, is that self-contradictory? Maybe it is. But if it isn't, then in some sense, you would say it was possible. In the other sense of possible, something would be possible only if it can be produced by a causal agent. Now, that first sense of possible, the one that merely requires lack of contradiction, internal consistency, that is a very broad and generous way of thinking about possibility. Many, many things are possible. When David Lewis talks about possibility, he often mentions the possibility of a talking donkey. And he makes it sound like it's so obvious that talking donkeys are possible. The second sense of possibility is the sense of possibility that is um, based on causal agency. And this one is much narrower. Only some things are possible, only the things that can be brought about by agents. And so that means that there might be some things that are possible in the first broad sense, but that are not possible in the narrow sense. So if you think that the broad sense is the correct sense, then the causal agent way of thinking about possibility won't be good enough for you. But if you like the causal agent story about what makes things possible, then you have a problem, maybe. Now, I think that for somebody like Aristotle, the narrow sense is the correct sense. And for Aristotle, there are a lot of things that you might think are possible, and they don't really seem contradictory, but they're not possible. They're just not possible. You can't have them. The world can't, for Aristotle, be very different from the way that it is. You can't get there from here, and you never had any chance to get there from anywhere. Now, maybe Aristotle is right about this. Maybe the world is more or less the way it is, and it can't be very different. Or maybe Aristotle is wrong, and maybe possibility is based instead on possible worlds. And since there's a possible world for every consistent way for things to be, then we have the broad, wide sense of possibility, and it's rooted metaphysically not in causal agents, but instead in possible worlds. However, maybe there's a third option. Maybe there's a way of keeping the notion of causal agency at the basis of possibility, but also a way somehow of saving the very broad sense of possibility. And I will talk about that next week. Okay, so I'm done for today. Thank you.